Very good morning, everyone, and a very warm greeting to all of you on this day of Gandhi Jayanti. Mahatma Gandhi ji earned his name Mahatma by being a crusader against the enemies within, and there can't be a more appropriate time to actually take a sankalpa for fighting the enemies within than the Navratri time that we are going through. So wish you all a very happy Navratri as well. As you all know, Ma Durga fights Mahishasur, so that's why she's called Mahishasur Mardini. But the Mahishasur is all the enemies that we have inside of us. So let's make that sankalpa to keep fighting the Mahishasurs inside of us. What I'm going to talk about today is a vision that the Honorable Prime Minister has articulated of making India a $5 trillion economy. Let me first start by articulating how ambitious or how realistic this goal is. I'm going to give you two arguments first. It's a big picture to help us understand how realistic this goal is. In the economic survey of 2018-19, we calculated that India needs to grow at 8% plus in real terms in order for it to achieve this goal of the $5 trillion economy. Now, how difficult is it? From 2014 to 2019, we grew at an average rate of 7.5%. And lest there are some questions about GDP growth rates, etc., recently I had tweeted on a very careful academic study that's been done, which shows that our GDP growth rates are indeed what they are. There is no overestimation. So with that footnote comment, let me actually remind you that we indeed grew at 7.5% from 2014 to 2019. If I have time, maybe if you could take some questions, possibly I might talk about the slowdown a little bit. But I think it is important to keep in mind that we grew at 7.5%, and therefore a 0.5% increase is both possible and at the same time reasonably ambitious. And as as MBAs are taught in our first class on organizational behavior, a little bit of a stretch goal is always a good thing to actually goad people, be it people like us or the nation, in trying to achieve something bigger. So 8% plus 8%, thereabouts, given that we've already grown at 7.5%, is something that is achievable. Look at it differently. One more way of looking at the same thing. So for us to create the first $1 trillion of GDP, it took us 55 years. Now, as GDP is measured in the local currency and then you convert it into dollars, so let's take the average conversion rate of dollar to rupee at, let's say, about 20, in the first 55 years. So $1 trillion, which is 1 lakh crores of dollars in GDP, or effectively 20 lakh crores or 20 trillion rupees of GDP in the first 55 years of our existence, of independent India. From 2014 to 2019, we added the same $1 trillion. We grew from 1.7 trillion to 2.7 trillion. So in a 5-year period, we added what we had added in 55 years. But what you have to contend with is that this happened at a much higher conversion rate. Take an average of 65 rupees to the dollar, which is what, it's a sort of a back of the envelope calculation from 2014 to 2019. So we added 65 trillion rupees in 5 years from 2014 to 2019, while we had added about 20 trillion rupees in a 55-year period. 20 trillion in 55 years versus 65 trillion in 5 years. just tells you that it is possible indeed to be able to achieve this goal of $5 trillion that we've set our targets to. What do we need to do if we have to achieve that goal? And that's what the main effort of the economic survey was, to try and lay out the blueprint, the strategic blueprint. Those of you who would have actually looked at the economic survey, as I had written in the preface, we had indulged in blue sky thinking to think about what should be the path that India should be following in order to achieve this goal of the $5 trillion economy. I would want to mention that the motivation behind trying to lay out this path was to recognize that whatever policies are implemented in the advanced economies today, those cannot be directly implemented in India because our stages of development are different. Instead, therefore, what we did was we looked at every economy that grew at 5% plus growth rates, 5% plus, over at least a decade since the Second World War. In other words, we look at all economies since the Second World War that grew at 5% plus over at least a decade. So high growth rates for a sustained period of time of at least a decade, and then tried to actually ferret out scholarly, through scholarly research, what is it that these economies did to be able to grow at that high rates of growth for a consistent period of time. And what we really arrived at is what the first chapter of the economic survey talks about, and then the other chapters lay out other ideas there, which I will share with you now. Before I describe what is being shown here as the virtuous cycle, I must remind you that at the macroeconomic level, it's important to remember that every variable is both a cause and an effect. Therefore, it is really important to actually distinguish between what is the key driver of economic development and what could be a force multiplier. To give you some just examples of what I'm talking about, investment today has the effect of improving productivity of firms, improving productivity of labor sometime later. An improvement in productivity increases wages with a lag. Increase in wages then puts purchasing power in the hands of people. Anticipating such purchasing power and the consumption that would arise out of it, firms invest further. And this is how the virtuous cycle goes. So as you can notice here, the improvement in productivity is the effect of the cause, which is investment. But improvement in productivity itself becomes the cause for increase in purchasing power. And increase in purchasing power then becomes the cause for further improvements in investment because of the anticipated consumption that it would generate. So as you can see, at the macroeconomic level, especially when you look over a large time period of maybe 15, 20 years, or even a few years, every variable is both a cause and an effect. And therefore, it is very important for policymakers to be able to come up with good policy to identify what is that key driver and what is a force multiplier. So the key message that we identified is that it's investment that is the key driver for growth in the economy at a stage that India is in, which is what every country has done, when we looked at since the Second World War. And consumption is a force multiplier. In other words, if we just focus on policies that are going to spur consumption, there will be some effect, but it actually will peter out. But if you want to have sustained growth over a reasonable period of time, then we must focus on investment, and that is what is really critical for us to be able to generate this 8% plus growth to be able to achieve the goal of the $5 trillion economy. So the key idea is that economies operate in a virtuous cycle, or sometimes even a vicious cycle. When economies are growing fast, this virtuous cycle is moving very, very fast. But when there is a slowdown, that virtuous cycle is not moving as fast. When there is a recession, and mind you, I'm talking about a recession, it is a vicious cycle. But economies move through these cycles, and that is what is really critical to understand. So that virtuous cycle starts with the investment and saving. Investment, and because as a household does, if you want to buy a car or if you want to buy a house, you have to save. Similarly, in the economy as well, if we have to make investments in infrastructure, in our human capital, which is education, healthcare, etc., we need to save as well. So saving is critical for investment. It is investment that starts this virtuous cycle. Investment leads to improvements in productivity. That's a second step that you see in that virtuous cycle. It is indeed improvements in productivity that are critical for exports to actually grow in an economy. And this is another very, very seminal fact that stands out, that no economy has been able to grow at sustained growth rates of high growth rates of 5% plus without being export competitive. Now think about it, when you buy an item, if you buy, let's say, a cell phone which is imported, I'm sure you do that because it is available at a lower price for the same quality or at a higher quality for the same price. In other words, that particular cell phone has been manufactured more productively by someone in a foreign economy, and that is why you are buying it. So productivity is extremely critical for exports to grow up. So exports actually are furthered by productivity. The virtuous cycle, as I said, starts from investment, which enhances productivity. Such productivity then leads to improvements in exports and jobs as well, and I'm going to show you some evidence to persuade that this is indeed what happens at the macroeconomic level. When exports go up and jobs are created, then people have purchasing power in their hands, and that is what then leads to demand, increase in demand. And that increase in demand, anticipating that, firms invest more, and that is how this virtuous cycle proceeds. So it starts with investment, which enhances productivity, that leads to better exports and jobs, which puts purchasing power in the hands of people, which fosters demand. Anticipating that demand, then firms invest more, and this virtuous cycle starts running faster and faster. When we are in a slowdown, this cycle actually slows down, and therefore it is really important to understand that at the core of the slowdown that we've had, the 5.8% growth in the in Q4 of the previous year and Q1 5.5% is essentially the investment slowdown, and that's what this particular chart shows very, very clearly. What is being plotted here is the gross fixed capital formation. This is just jargon that economists use for the investment rate in an economy. Notice here that it reached its peak at over 40%, around 2008 or so. And then after that, it has declined. And this is really critical for us to understand. Of course, the bottoming up has happened, it started going up, but we need the investment rate to go up significantly for us to be back to that 7.5% and then 8% growth rates. Now, I would want to make a comment here that oftentimes commentators talk about, we need consumption. Absolutely, we do need, but consumption is the force multiplier. And therefore, when we think about actually fiscal stimuli, we really need to keep in mind that in order for sustained growth to happen, it is investment that is really critical. It's the decrease in investment that has then not created enough jobs or exports, which has then had a telling effect on demand and purchasing power. So if we really need to be making our economy grow faster, we need to bring these investment rates up. So what do we need to do in order to be able to increase these investment rates and to increase productivity? I'm going to touch on 2 or 3 important structural reasons that we need to, reasons or factors that we need to address in order to push this investment rate up. Before that, let me just give you some evidence, learning from other economies. In the survey, we've shown evidence for not only China, but the Asian tigers as well, about what they did in order to, grow at the really high growth rates that they did. In the interest of time, I'm only going to show you evidence from China, but let me emphasize again, this is something that remains common to every economy that has grown at a fast rate. What you would notice here is that the red line is showing consumption to GDP. And the blue and the green lines are showing savings and investment in China, starting from 1980s on to, up till now. What you notice, the red chart clearly shows that the Chinese economy consumed less and less as a percentage of its GDP so that it could save more and thereby invest more. And that is very important to remember. As I had mentioned, even a household does this. If you have to make an investment, you have to save, you cannot consume as much. And that is what the Chinese economy did, cut down on consumption. Now remember, this is consumption as a percentage of GDP. As GDP was increasing, in terms of the yuan value, consumption, did increase. But as a percentage of GDP, consumption decreased significantly, while savings and investment increased significantly. There's another way which actually this can be shown, because what this chart does not show is what stage the Chinese economy was in terms of its development. Now, if we have to see what China did as it became more and more developed, what I'm going to do here is to change the variable and use GDP per capita instead of calendar time. So this is put, to the base, log to the base 10, those of you who are technically interested, which basically converts into $1,000 of GDP. When the value is 3, that is $1,000. What I would want you to take away here is that as the Chinese economy became more and more advanced as measured by its increase in the per capita GDP, China invested a greater proportion of its GDP on consumption and a greater proportion on investment, and exported more. This is really important to keep in mind. This is the virtuous cycle that I'm talking about. If, for instance, these lines were flat, then we would infer that China was investing the same level of GDP as a percentage on investment and exporting the same proportion. But what is critical here is, as the Chinese economy became more and more advanced, China started investing more of its GDP in investment, and thereby enhancing productivity, thereby increasing exports as well. This is the virtuous cycle that I'm talking about. If, for instance, these lines were flat, I would not make the claim of a virtuous cycle, because what this is telling you is an increase in GDP per capita made China invest more of its GDP in investment and export more, and thereby increase its per capita GDP further. And that's how the virtuous cycle proceeded to run faster and faster. That's what delivered the close to 10% growth rates that China achieved during this period from 1980s onwards. These are some pieces of evidence, and that is what is the highlight of the economic survey. We do not give out opinions. We actually try and provide evidence-based policy suggestions. So what you see on the left-hand side here is the growth in investment. I don't know whether people at the back will be able to read what is on the axis, so let me just explain. What you see on the left charts, I want your attention on the left chart here. On the x-axis, what you see is increase in the investment rate, and on the y-axis is an increase in productivity. And what you see on the right-hand chart is an increase in productivity, and on the y-axis you see increase in exports. So what you notice here is that as investment increases, productivity increases. That's on the left chart. And as productivity increases, exports go up as well. And this, even a visual eye can make out. So if you do the thought experiment of removing that blue line from that chart and just look at the collection of points there are, you will still make the inference that there is a clear positive correlation here, Now, remember, at the macroeconomic level, all you can talk about is correlation, but the survey has some, important econometric work, statistical work that shows the causality as well. So the takeaway from this slide is that investment increases productivity, which is what leads to improvements in exports. So that's this part of the virtuous cycle that I've talked about. This part, which is investment to productivity, productivity to exports. Similarly, now this is often a comment that is made that, oh, investment can reduce jobs. The usual sort of canonical example that is given is think about ATM machines that came, they took away the jobs of tellers. Turns out that when you look at it in a very partial sense, yes, ATMs basically took away the jobs of tellers. But think also about the number of people who would have worked in discovering an ATM machine, those that would have worked in manufacturing the ATM machine, those that need to basically transport it, sit there to actually monitor the security guards that have to be there, those that have to bring in money. When you take all that into account, the entire value chain, the evidence is very, very clear that investment actually increases jobs in the economy, and that is what this particular chart shows. On the x-axis, you have increases in investment, and on the y-axis is unemployment rate. So it's the reverse of employment. What you notice is that as investment goes up at the economic level, which takes into account all these effects that I spoke about, not just the partial of ATMs taking away jobs of tellers. When you look at the economic level, unemployment rate goes down with an increase in the investment rate. So that is this other part of the virtuous cycle that I spoke about. So investment increases productivity, which I showed you evidence increases exports and also creates more jobs in the economy. And that's what then leads to improvements in demand, thereby feeds the virtuous cycle. Now let me actually focus on a few factors that are important for us to think about how do we increase the productivity. Think about, about nature. What you see on the left-hand side here is a dwarf tree, and what you see on the right-hand side of, to where you're sitting is a giant tree. A giant tree gives you fruits, gives you shade, does not need to be tended by the gardener. The gardener only needs to tend to it when it was a sapling. But the dwarf tree has to be tended all the time, and neither does it give you fruits, nor does it give you shade. And nature, in fact, if you think about it, tries and preserve these giant trees, and that's what leads to this lokokti in Hindi, honhar birwan ke hot chikne paat. The gardener looks at the thin-leaved saplings and says that these are the ones that are going to grow up and become giant trees. That's what nature does. Why? Because even in nature, resources are scarce. And when resources are scarce, they need to be directed to the most efficient means. And that is what nature does, which is what we need to be doing in the economy as well. Now, this relates to, there may be questions about jobs, etc. It is important to remember that we, over the last 7 decades, have not been following what nature does, which is, direct scarce resources to where it is efficiently used. And that I actually want to show you using this particular chart here. What you see is manufacturing firms in the Indian economy. The red bars here correspond to firms that are really small, firms that have less than 99 employees in their roles. And the purple bars correspond to those that are reasonably large, not necessarily very large in the international context, but large in the Indian context, which have more than 100 employees. Now, I want you to pay very careful attention because there's always this narrative that is put out that MSMEs and SMEs are big job creators in the economy. Take a look at the first, the set of bars on the left-hand side, which is the number of firms. The middle one is for employment, and the right one is for value added. What you notice is that if you take 100 firms in organized manufacturing in India, 85 of these firms are really small. They have less than 99 employees. 85% are small firms, very, very, very small firms. 15% large firms. Now, look at the contribution of these firms to employment. Those 85 firms are only contributing 22.9% to employment, while these firms that account for 15.7%, that have more than 100 employees on their rolls, are contributing 77% to employment. This is an important fact that comes out from the data from the annual survey of industries, that it is actually the firms that grow to become large, who are the ones that create jobs. And that actually makes intuitive sense as well. A firm that has 1,000 workers obviously creates 1,000 jobs, while a firm that has only 100 workers creates only 100 jobs. And this is really important to keep in mind. Also look at their contribution to productivity, which is related to the virtuous cycle that I spoke about. 85 of those firms contribute to only 11.6% in terms of value added, which is a proxy for productivity. In other words, these really small firms are occupying just a tiny bit of the productivity in the economy. It's the large firms that are accounting for close to 90% of the productivity, of the value added in the economy, which basically is very, very important to keep in mind. One of the cardinal principles that we are taught in economics is that scale economies of scale, is really important for productivity improvements. What these small firms are not doing is exploiting those scale economies. Now, the question that arises is, why is this, why do we obtain this? So these are the kind of policies, having been on many committees over the last 10 years, this is very, very common. So you want to implement some policy, ठीक है, let's do it. जो 100 से कम actually employees लगाते हैं, उनको लगा दो, ठीक है. Those firms that are actually, that have a size above a certain threshold, let's put the policy on them. So every policy we do this size-based threshold, saying we leave out the small firms, we will not apply them to the small firms, apply to the large firms. What does that then do? It creates a perverse incentive for the small firms to continue to remain small, because they know very well that if they grow beyond the particular size, they will not obtain the benefit that they're currently getting. It's as if, think about, all of us have used these when we, maybe for our kids, when we learned bicycling, we gave them those training wheels. If we told the kid that you're going to have these training wheels for a lifetime, save a couple of kids that might be self-motivated, the average kid would not have become an independent biker. Good parenting is about saying to the kid that when you are learning, of course, have these training wheels, we'll support you as a parent, but you need to become independent. And that is something that we've not followed in the economy over the last 7 decades. And this is not something that has happened in the last few years. This is consistently what we've been following over the last 7 decades. Every policy that I've listed down here basically has a size-based threshold which exempts the small firms, but or gives some benefits to small firms, and penalizes the larger firms, and thereby creates a perverse incentive for firms to remain small. And it transpires in the following sense. Once you reach, let's say, 95, 98 employees, if you become more than 100, labor laws will apply to you. So you actually create a firm in your wife's name, or maybe your brother-in-law's name, or maybe your cook, or even your driver's name, to try and keep that firm less than that threshold so that you can continue availing the benefits. You don't avail economies of scale, and that reduces productivity in the economy and also contributes to lack of job creation in the economy. So this is something that we really need to fix if we have to have this virtuous cycle operating much fast. So what is the policy nudge? The main recommendation we've made is that all these benefits should be given to infant firms. So the incentives should be based on age of the firm, not on the size of the firm, because if we provide it based on size, we are incentivizing dwarfs in the economy. And as I was telling you earlier, nature also follows this policy. Because resources are scarce, it directs it to those trees that can grow and become giant. Similarly, the economy as well, we must be directing our scarce resources to those firms that contribute most to the jobs and to productivity in the economy. And these are SMEs that can grow to become bigger. So another policy implication that comes out is that there must be a sunset clause for each one of these policies. Tell the firms that, for the next 6 years, 7 years, you will get this benefit, but only for that period. You need to grow out of your size limitation, of the size limitation in the next 7 years, and that would provide the incentive for the firm to grow, because it knows very well that if it does not grow out in the next 6 or 7 years, it will not obtain this policy, this benefit. So that's the key policy nudge that we need to do in order to enhance both jobs and productivity in the economy. Second, labor law restrictions. India's labor law restrictions remain very, very stringent, and that's something. So if you notice here, this is again, something that we showed in the survey. What is being shown in red here is every policy, every labor policy is applicable to a large firm. So if you take the Industrial Disputes Act, it applies to firms that have more than 100 employees. Every other, labor law as well, small firms are exempt, and thereby there is a perverse incentive for the firm to continue to remain small. What we also did is to show what is the benefit of relaxing these labor laws. So take a look at what we are showing here is across all the states in the country, separated it by states that have labor laws that are flexible and states that have inflexible labor laws. So the red color corresponds to those states that have inflexible labor laws. Notice that the number of workers, the wages, as well as the capital is lower and is not increasing at as good a rate in those economies that, in those states where labor laws are inflexible. This is making the point that if we need to have more employment, if we need to have more investment and enhance productivity in the economy, it is important to have states liberalizing their labor laws. And the best example of that comes from Rajasthan. Rajasthan in 2014 had relaxed its labor law restrictions, increased the size at which the labor law, Industrial Disputes Act was applicable from 100 to 300. Notice what happens after Rajasthan does this reform. And this, by the way, we've done very careful work here to take care of all confounding factors. Many of you will come up and say, oh, this is not because of the labor law restriction, it's because of something else. But we've taken care of that, those concerns. That is what you earn a PhD for, to be able to show that this is indeed because of the policy change. So the way to look at it, this one is, the yellow bars show the growth rate of the number of firms with more than 100 employees, so the large firms. The yellow bars show the growth rates before the reform. The green bars show the same growth rate after the reform. Notice the change in the growth rates for Rajasthan versus the rest of India. For Rajasthan, the growth rate before reform was about 3.6%, shoots up to 9.3% after the reform for Rajasthan. In the rest of India also it is increasing, but not increasing at the kind of rate that Rajasthan delivered. So rest of India was 4.6%, so was greater than that in Rajasthan, but increases only to 5.5%. So overall, there is a trend to in India to actually have larger firms, but the policy change that Rajasthan did especially created much larger firms. Not only did it create larger firms, it also created greater so maybe that's not getting shown. It also created a lot more workers. The number of workers increased, the productivity increased as well, and those evidence are there in the economic survey. So to summarize that, the labor law restrictions, reducing those labor law restrictions indeed creates jobs, enhances productivity, and increases the number of large firms in the economy. So the key policy implication that comes out, and this is really pertinent for all states to pay attention to, because labor is also a state subject, that they should follow the what Rajasthan has done and reap the benefits of that by reducing labor law restrictions. Another policy that states can think about is to allow a certain percentage, a very small percentage of employees to be fired without having to seek permission from the government. Why is this important? Because if in a factory, if you know that a particular employee has been asked to leave because he or she does not pull his or her weight, and does not contribute enough, then the rest of the people will say, okay, that fate could befall on us as well, and thereby it will start working harder. And this is, or working to just earn their wage really, rather than being unproductive. So this is another important aspect for a very small percentage. Doesn't need to be very large. So maybe 1 worker, 2 workers, up to 5% of workers, and this can be designed easily by states. But just create that deterrent effect, saying if you are not pulling your weight, then you will basically there will be consequences. You cannot actually have a sinecure for life, and irrespective of whether or not you do your job. So that is an important policy nudge that states need to think about based on the benefits that Rajasthan has already reaped. A third, which is basically, I think, very, very important, it's pertinent across the entire country, which is the legal logjam. There are close to 3 crore cases that are basically clogged in our courts, out of which close to 90% is stuck in the lower courts, which is the district and the subordinate courts. 90% in the district and subordinate courts. So one of the chapters in the economic survey focuses on this particular point, because while we have improved on the ease of doing business, we still lag abysmally behind in the ease of enforcing contracts. And ease of enforcing contracts is about the legal, about the legal infrastructure. We rank 163 out of 192 countries. Think about it, bottom 15% in the ease of contractual enforcement. This is for all the learned judges and the lawyers and all those that are actually part of the legal fraternity to take note of, because I certainly, as an Indian, do not feel proud looking and finding my country in the bottom 15% in terms of the ease of contract enforcement. So what do we need to do? 2 simple things that can actually help here. One, we actually need to increase the clearance rate. So make sure that there are no cases that are piling up, and that we can do by bringing a 100% clearance rate. What we've shown in the survey is that 100% clearance rate, both at the district and subordinate courts and the higher courts, which is the Supreme Court and the High Court, can be achieved. 100% clearance rate can be achieved by just enhancing the number of judges within sanctioned capacity. So ensuring that recruitment of these judges happens within sanctioned capacity. So it doesn't need any legislative change at all. That will ensure that 100% clearance rate happens. If there is 100% clearance rate, there is no build-up of the backlog. But we also need to be reducing this backlog, and what we've shown is that a 25% improvement in productivity, only a 25%, which can be done by working a few hours more, by reducing the vacations that are taken by the judiciary, and by bringing in more technology. 25% improvement in productivity can reduce the entire backlog of cases within the next 5 years. And that is actually not a very, very, I think it's a realistic target. 25% improvement in productivity is certainly doable, provided the legal fraternity comes together and says that this is something that, as a national cause, we need to get over our individual interests and come together and really work towards improving this, because this has the immense benefits that we will generate on the economic side will be just seen to will have to be seen to be believed. Now let me actually talk about something that was very, very dear to Mahatma Gandhiji, which was behavioral change. I had the good fortune of learning behavioral economics from Professor Richard Thaler at the University of Chicago. And when I learned it, I actually realized that India provides possibly the best laboratory to be able to implement behavioral change, because in our country, our behavior is driven significantly by our social, cultural, and spiritual norms. And so what we did was to look at some of the behavioral changes that have been brought, and I think the best is the Swachh Bharat mission, which was launched on on Gandhi Jayanti itself. What I want you to take away here is what happened to the toilets and the open defecation in India before and after. So what you see on the left, in both these charts, are the individual household latrine in 2015-16 and 2018-19. And on the right side, you see the India map for the open defecation-free villages in 2015-16 and 2018-19. As the colors clearly demonstrate, red means less coverage, green means more coverage. There's clearly been significant improvement on both counts, which is the IHHL and the open defecation-free villages. Now, many times critics will say, okay, we've built toilets, but are people using it? The best way to assess that is to see if the health indicators have improved. Because if sanitation indeed improves, then health outcomes should be the first thing that should actually show up as the effect. And here's where, and what a policymaker must do is to not just go by anecdotes, go by aggregate evidence and average evidence. And that is what we've tried to do. So if you were to ask the question, suppose we transport ourselves back to 2015-16 and ask the question, where would the impact be the greatest in terms of health outcomes? Obviously, those areas that are red in the chart in 2015-16, that's where the health outcomes should have been the best, because that's where the sanitation outcomes improved the most. And that is exactly what we did. That's a test that I'm going to show you the results of. So look at those areas that are actually shaded red versus areas that were shaded green. Let's look at the improvement in health outcomes in areas that were shaded red in 2015-16 versus 2018-19 and see what we find. So this is the data on children that actually had diarrhea, cases of diarrhea for children under 5 years. And as you see, the ones on the red are those districts that were red as of 2015-16. So these ones, the red ones that you see there. What you notice is the decrease. So what you see on the left here are for those red areas in 2015-16, and what you see on the right are for the greener areas. Clearly, there's been improvement there as well, because even the light green has become dark green. But look at the drastic fall in cases of diarrhea, for children below 5 years. This is indeed evidence showing that, yes, there has been significant improvement in sanitation outcomes, which is reflected in the health outcomes, because the decrease in cases of diarrhea among children below 5 years has indeed been perceptible in in those areas where sanitation coverage was poor. It's not just for diarrhea cases. You see this impact for malaria cases. You see the impact for underweight children that are born, that are stillborn. All these health outcomes have also shown significant impact. So let me actually summarize once again that if this criticism that toilets have been built but toilets are not being used, if that criticism were true, this result would not be obtained. That health outcomes are the first indicator of improvements in sanitation. There's been perceptible improvement in the health outcomes in those areas where, especially those areas where the sanitation was poor in 2015-16 before the Swachh Bharat mission was launched. So quickly, just these are some of the ideas for behavioral change that can be implemented in the Indian context, from Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, to basically going to Badlav, which is basically an anagram for Beti Aapki Dhan Lakshmi or Vijay Lakshmi. From the Swachh Bharat mission to more to health outcomes prevention, instead of cure, which is basically a Swasth and Sundar Bharat. From Give It Up LPG, which is the first instance of people voluntarily giving up their subsidies, to think about the subsidy itself and giving up, all subsidies that actually, particularly those that are well off, do not deserve. Going from tax evasion to tax compliance, and these are all areas where behavioral economics can make a big difference in really change, bringing about behavioral change. So, in sum, what I've talked about today is to show that economies work on a virtuous cycle. When the economy grows fast, that virtuous cycle is moving very fast. When there is a slowdown, that virtuous cycle is not moving as fast. When there is a recession, that virtuous cycle becomes a vicious cycle. Now, what is really critical, therefore, is in order for us to achieve that goal of the $5 trillion economy, we need to focus on investment, because investment is the key driver of economic development in an economy like India. Consumption is a force multiplier. And in order for that investment to go up, we need to basically be nourishing infant firms, not dwarfs. That's number one. We need to reduce the labor law restrictions, thereby be able to create jobs and improve productivity in the economy and exports, and reduce the legal logjam, which is a clarion call to the legal fraternity to try and actually implement some of the suggestions that we've made in the economic survey for reducing the legal logjam. We can complement that with movement that is already underway through the Swachh Bharat mission and many other initiatives under the able leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister on bringing about behavioral change to enhance policy impact. I thank you a lot for your patient hearing. And very happy to be here. Thank you.
I am stood here as a common man. I want to know, is India's GDP accurate? Some experts are saying that it is less than 5%.
So I have actually tweeted on this. Go and take a look at some of the tweets that I made on my Twitter page on Sunday. But let me give you some specific answers on this. Firstly, India is a democracy where policy goes through several different touch points. And despite any narratives that you will hear, I have been in government for the last 8 months, and I can definitely tell you that the ability to express yourself within government is something that is absolutely granted to all the policymakers. Therefore, if there was an effort to create a narrative that is different from the truth, because a chain is only as strong as the weakest link, and in this case, that weakest link would be someone who does not want to go with a false narrative, that person will squeal. So in a democracy like India, it is very hard to maintain a narrative that is different from the truth. That is actually a philosophical answer. Second point, if indeed there was actually some, if there was possibly some inaccuracy or, muddying up of the numbers, the incentive to muddy up numbers is precisely when the growth rate is slower. So either we actually have a slowdown or our GDP numbers are accurate. That's the second point. Third point is there was actually, this is where it's very important to actually be very careful in the inference that is drawn. I've tweeted on this academic study that's been done by this University of Michigan Ross School of Business professor, looking at the same, so the experts that you called, showing that the inference that's been made by those experts is wrong, because some of the important statistical techniques and statistical validations that need to be implemented in order to actually make an inference, those have not been implemented. So to give you some details, there, one can do correlations of the GDP growth with what are called, these high-frequency indicators. Now, those who have learned their statistics would actually acknowledge that correlations, by definition, change a lot over time. What the technical term that statisticians use is that correlations are non-stationary, which means they keep changing. So even if there was absolutely no change in the GDP methodology, you would still find, and indeed, these studies, there are articles that have been written as well, you would find changes in these correlations. So you cannot infer, but just by showing that pre-post the change in the GDP methodology, because there is a change in the correlation, that the GDP methodology is incorrect or GDP numbers are wrong. Another important point, which is actually, I think this is important, if you go back to our high school arithmetic, even if you change the numerator and the denominator in a fraction, it does not mean, suppose you increase the numerator and the denominator, that does not mean that the fraction will be higher than the original fraction. Just, this is high school arithmetic. I want you to go and check with ask everyone to go and check. So for instance, take a fraction like half, add 1 to both of them, you get 2 by 3. 2 by 3 actually is bigger. It doesn't mean, if you subtract it, you may get, 0. So you can do these calculations and show that just adding a number to the numerator denominator does not change the GDP growth rate. Indeed, this study shows that if you do the methodology a lot more carefully, there is absolutely no overestimation of the GDP growth rate. And let me come back. The growth rate is a fraction. Why? When you calculate the growth rate, you take the GDP this year, divide it by the GDP last year, and subtract 1 from it to get the growth rate. So even if, let's say, GDP values were overestimated or underestimated in both the years, does not necessarily imply a difference in the growth rate. This is an important point, but actually, I could spend half an hour just answering this question, but let me tell you that I'm completely convinced, and there is now careful academic evidence which refutes any claim that our growth rates are overestimated.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. I'm sure there are many, many hands going up to ask questions, but we've run out of time. So we'll move to the next question.
Just one simple question here.
Sorry?
One question here, please. Hello, here, this side.
We're running behind schedule by 10 minutes.
No. I think all this 5 trillion talk needs, we need to know at what exchange rate are you assuming this? If you are talking it in terms of dollars, 5 trillion, my quick calculation, back of the envelope calculation, it should be at 57 rupees. Is it possible? And what is the rate that you assumed? One. The second question is, you are making a case for bigger organizations. More employment. More employees per organization.
So we are running out of time.
One second. In terms of value addition, you have a strong case. But in terms of return on capital employed, can you make out a case?
May I request you for a short answer, please?
Yeah. So the short answer to the first question is, I would urge you to go and read the first chapter in the economic survey, because I can't, get into the details here. It's 8% plus growth rate. There are some assumptions made about the movement in the exchange rate. Now, even on return on capital employed, not value added, look at, and that is one of the things that we did. We looked at every measure. When you have dwarf firms that basically remain small despite having aged, their productivity, their return on capital employed, their return on equity, their return on assets, all of those are much worse compared to firms that actually grow and become bigger, because it's about economies of scale, which is one of the most important things for bringing about improvements in productivity. Thank you.